What's up guys, and welcome to another video. I'd like to thank you all for the amazing comments and constructive criticism, specifically on this video right here, which hit a whopping 80,000 views. A lot of amazing feedback and comments. Thank you all once again. Now, without further ado, let's get to the video. So in the previous video, we looked at how to make your video look cinematic through editing, along with a few tips and tricks. Well, in today's video, we're gonna look at the most cinematic camera settings. Starting off with FPS, or frames per second. Now, this depends on a few factors. First of all, which country you live in, along with if you wanna slow down your video or not. So if you live in PALland, you're probably gonna be shooting at 25 or 50 frames a second. NTSC, it's going to be at 24 or 60. Now, most cinematic videos and Hollywood films are shot at 24 or 25 frames a second. And the reason for that being, well, there's two theories that I've read. And one is that in the history, old times, they shot videos at 24 because it was more cheaper and economical for them. And that pretty much just stuck throughout history. The other theory is that your human eye cannot observe more than 24 frames a second. Now, I don't know which theory is true, but most movies are shot at 24 or 25 frames a second, with few exceptions, of course. Now, as far as higher frame rates go, these depend if you want to slow down your video and how much you want to slow it down. So you'd shoot at 60 or let's say 120 and slow it down all the way to 24, and you get that buttery smooth slow motion. So let's jump on to shutter speed. And that goes hand in hand with frames per second. And I'll explain to you exactly why. Now, what shutter speed do you want to be shooting at? Well, there's a 180-degree rule, which basically tells you that your frame rate, your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. And why would you do that? Well, it's simple, because that would give you the right amount of motion blur to make it look cinematic. If you observe that higher shutter speeds have less motion blur and lower shutter speeds have more motion blur. And using the 180-degree shutter rule, you're gonna get just that perfect amount of motion blur to make it look cinematic. So that's as far as shutter speeds go. Another tip is if you're shooting at high frame rates, you want to make sure that your shutter speed is not lower than your frames per second. So if you're shooting at 120 frames a second, you wanna make sure your frame rate is higher than 120. Otherwise, you're gonna have a choppy slow motion effect when you slow it down. Now, you shouldn't follow these rules blindly. Know when to use them and when to break them depending on the situation, if you want more motion blur or less motion blur. But the general consensus is use the 180-degree shutter rule to get that adequate motion blur. Now, another thing that most new cameras and DSLRs, mirrorless cameras have is picture profile. So you can adjust these depending on what looks you want to achieve, but most of the time you want to have a slightly flatter color profile. And the reason for that being is it maximizes dynamic range, and it gives you a lot more flexibility in editing, and it also retains a lot more information than shadows and highlights, which is your dynamic range. Now, for Canon cameras, that usually has, I believe it's called a picture style, and that has contrast, sharpness, and that saturation, and you can just bring that down to improve that dynamic range. For Sony and mirrorless cameras, you have the picture profile, which can be adjusted from 1 to 6, or S-Log, which is a flat color profile. But in short, as mentioned in the GoPro video, you want to shoot most of the time in a flat color profile to maximize dynamic range. This isn't a must, but if you want to get that extra dynamic range from your camera, that's the way to do it. But keep in mind, it's going to look quite flat, and it's going to require a lot more color grading in post to bring it back to life. Now, the last thing left is the aperture, or f-stop. What aperture should you use? Now, this is the most flexible one, which also depends on the lens you're going to be using. Lower f-stop lenses tend to be more expensive, but not all the time. So what f-stop should you use? Well, that depends on the look you're trying to achieve. If you want a shallow depth of field with your subject in focus and your background's blurred, then you should use a lower aperture. If you want everything to be in focus simultaneously, your subject and background, then you're going to want to use a higher f-stop. Now, having a low f-stop helps in low light as well, because you don't want to be adjusting your shutter speed too much based on the 180-degree shutter rule. You don't want to increase your ISO too much because your video is going to be grainy. So the only thing left is your aperture, which you want to be as low as possible to avoid having that grainy, noisy video. So once again, thank you guys for watching the video. I hope you guys learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comment section below. Also, if you have any tutorial requests, you can also leave them in the comment section below. Once again, thank you guys for watching. You can follow me on Instagram to see a lot of cool photos that I post. And that's it for this one. I'll see you guys next time.